بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. Last week we spoke about how the French commander Napoleon in the late 1700s occupied Egypt, and then after occupying Egypt he tried to unsuccessfully occupy Palestine as well. He was actually able to occupy a few cities within Palestine, but he failed to conquer Akka, which is a very important city in Palestine on the Mediterranean coast. He tried to conquer Akka and he failed. And eventually he decided to leave Palestine after disease spread inside his army. So Napoleon, he left Palestine and he retreated back to Egypt, and he had already occupied Egypt. But then when he came back into Egypt, there were revolts from the people of Egypt. And also there were issues that were happening in France, internal matters that were happening in France that Napoleon had to take care of. So he left Egypt and he went back to France. But when he left Egypt, when Napoleon left Egypt, some of the French army remained behind in Egypt. Some of the French army still remained behind in Egypt. So the Ottomans prepared an army to completely rid Egypt of French military occupation. Right? Egypt was one of the Ottoman lands. So when Napoleon and the French army occupied it, of course the Ottomans, they wanted it back. So Napoleon left, but there were still French soldiers stationed in Egypt, and the Ottomans wanted to get rid of them completely. So they prepared an army for this task. And the commander of the Ottoman army in Egypt was an Albanian Ottoman general by the name of Muhammad Ali Pasha. Muhammad Ali Pasha. So in the year 1801, Muhammad Ali Pasha's army successfully defeated the French military that was stationed in Egypt, and the French presence in Egypt was expelled. A few years later, in the year 1805, Muhammad Ali Pasha was officially appointed by the Ottoman Sultan as the governor of Egypt. So he was given the title by the Ottomans. Muhammad Ali Pasha was given the title by the Ottomans as the Wali of Egypt, meaning the governor of Egypt. But he himself, Muhammad Ali Pasha, decided to take the title of Al-Khedivate instead. He wanted to be known as Al-Khedivate. Al-Khedivate is an honorific title for a ruler. So he basically gave this name to himself, Al-Khedivate. So as his grip on Egypt strengthened, so Muhammad Ali Pasha, he has control of Egypt now, and he's under the Ottomans. But he has control of Egypt, and his grip on Egypt, it became very strong. And then Muhammad Ali Pasha became ambitious, and he made plans to separate from the Ottomans. He wanted to rule Egypt independently. He didn't want to be under the Ottoman umbrella, right? So this was his ambition. And he saw that around this time period, this is the early 1800s, he saw that the Ottoman Empire was in decline. Right? The Ottoman Empire had reached its peak in the 1500s or the 1600s, around that period of time. But by the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire, even though they had expanded greatly over the years, they were in decline at that time. Right? Their power had become weak at that time. Right? So Muhammad Ali Pasha, he saw that the Ottoman Empire was in decline and it was becoming weaker, and he decided to take advantage of this. And he thought that this would be his opportunity to establish his own state. And he had dreams of annexing Palestine and Syria to his lands as well. So now he controlled Egypt, but he wanted Palestine and Syria under his control as well. This was his dream. So in order to achieve this, he formed an army in Egypt and he headed towards Palestine with his army, with the intention of taking it over from the Ottomans, even though he himself was officially a governor under the Ottomans. He headed with an army from Egypt to Palestine with the intention of taking Egypt over from the Ottomans. And the Ottomans, when they saw what was happening, they sent an army to stop him. So now, the Ottomans were basically fighting against themselves. It became like a civil war for control of Palestine. Now at this point, the British became concerned. They saw that Muhammad Ali Pasha al-Khedivate was becoming more and more powerful, and they did not want him to become too powerful, right? The British, their strategy was to let the Muslims fight each other, but no one should become too powerful. He wanted the different Muslim factions to fight against each other and weaken each other. This was the goal of the British. So when the British saw that Al-Khedivate, Muhammad Ali Pasha, was becoming too powerful for their comfort, they felt that this would throw a wrench in the future British plans for that region. The British, they knew that the Ottoman Empire was declining, and they were happy with that. They wanted the Ottoman Empire to decline. But at the same time, they did not want Al-Khedivate, Muhammad Ali Pasha, they didn't want him to form a new Muslim empire that would become strong, right? They didn't want that to happen. So the British decided to get involved in this dispute between Al-Khedivate and the Ottomans. The British got involved and they helped the Ottomans against Al-Khedivate, right? They sent British soldiers, they sent British soldiers to Sham to prevent Al-Khedivate from taking over Palestine and Sham. So with this support from the British, the Ottomans were able to hold Al-Khedivate off, and for the time being, Palestine and Sham remained under the control of the Ottomans. For the time being, it remained under the control of the Ottomans. All right. Now, around this same time period, big things were happening in Britain as well. Big things were happening in England as well. A prominent Jewish businessman in London named Moshe Montefiore, Moses Montefiore, he married a woman named Judith Cohen. And Judith's sister, Hannah, married a man named Nathan Rothschild, the head of the Rothschild banking business in England. The Rothschild family was a Jewish family that originally had German origins, a German Jewish family. And this family, the Rothschild family, still even up to today, it is one of the wealthiest, richest families in the world. So this Jewish businessman, Moses Montefiore, he married Judith Cohen, and Judith's sister Hannah married Nathan Rothschild. So Moses Montefiore and Nathan Rothschild basically became brothers-in-law because their wives were sisters. Their wives were sisters, so they became close. They became basically brothers-in-laws. So Moses Montefiore and Nathan Rothschild, they decided to go into business together, and they became very powerful. And of course, they had strong connections and influence on the British government as well. So they had political influence and they had massive amounts of wealth. That Rothschild fortune was behind them, right? So Moses Montefiore, with the support of his brother-in-law Rothschild, and also with support from the British government, from the British crown, they decided, they were both Jews. Moses Montefiore and Nathan Rothschild, they're both Jews. So with this wealth and with this political influence, they organized an official open campaign to settle the Jews in Palestine, for Jewish settlement in Palestine. And they wanted to declare Palestine as the rightful homeland of the Jewish people, right? So they put a lot of pressure on the Ottoman Empire to allow Jews to start settling in Palestine. Now the Ottoman Empire, they were declining at this time. right? And there was a lot of pressure upon them from all over Europe. And the Ottomans, they were in great debt as well. They owed a lot of money to Europe as well. So due to all of this pressure, as a result of this intense pressure, in the year 1828, under this political pressure from the British, the Ottomans finally issued a decree allowing Jews to settle in Palestine. Now, as we spoke about earlier, before, the Ottomans allowed the Jews to come into Ottoman lands, but Palestine was off limits. They did not allow Jews to settle in Palestine because they knew that Jews had some long-term plan for Palestine. So for centuries, the Ottomans had allowed Jews from Europe to come and settle in the Ottoman Empire, but not in Palestine. But now, in the year 1828, under all of this pressure, the Ottomans finally issued a decree to allow the Jews to settle in Palestine, and they also allowed them to establish their organizations within Palestine. So this man, Moses Montefiore, who was behind this movement, he reached out to the Jews all around Europe, in Britain, in Italy, in Romania, all the way up to Russia. He reached out to all of the Jews to support the call for Jews to relocate and settle in Palestine. Right? So this was a big change in the dynamic in Palestine. Jews are now allowed to come in and settle in Palestine. The Ottomans were officially allowing it at this point. Now, while all of this was happening, Al-Khedivate, Muhammad Ali Pasha in Egypt, he continued to get stronger. He was still getting stronger. And in order to strengthen his military, he instituted compulsory military service on the youth. You know, the young men, when they reach a certain age, they are obligated to join the military. So he imposed that on the youth. And he also imposed taxes on the people to support his military ambitions. He wants to establish a strong military, and that requires manpower and it requires money. So how was he getting the money? By levying taxes on the people. And how was he getting the manpower? By making military service compulsory upon the young men. And you know, his ambition was to get a strong military because he still had this goal to take over Palestine and to take over Sham. So he was able to strengthen his military. And the main commander of Muhammad Ali Pasha, the main commander of Al-Khedivate, Muhammad Ali Pasha, was his son, Ibrahim Pasha. Ibrahim Pasha, the son of Muhammad Ali Pasha, he was the main commander of his father's army. So in the year 1831, Ibrahim Pasha, on behalf of his father, Al-Khedivate, Muhammad Ali Pasha, Ibrahim Pasha moved forward with the goal of expanding his father's lands. So he went into the Hijaz, and he was able to take the Hijaz in the Arabian Peninsula, and he was able to take other parts of the Arabian Peninsula as well from the Arab leaders there. Also, he was finally able to take Palestine and Sham from the Ottomans. He was successfully able to take Palestine and Sham from the Ottomans. And he solicited financial support from the Jews. Ibrahim Pasha, he called out to the Jews to help him and to support him. And the Jews, they accepted this call. They supported Ibrahim Pasha because they saw this as a means for the Muslims to fight each other. They saw, okay, Ibrahim Pasha and his soldiers, they're going to fight the Ottomans to take over Palestine and Sham. That means Muslims are going to be fighting against Muslims. So the Jews saw this as an opportunity. Let the Muslims fight each other, right? So they supported this. When Ibrahim Pasha asked for the help of the Jews gave him their support. So then in the year 1834, 10,000 of the Muslims of Jerusalem revolted against Ibrahim Pasha. Ibrahim Pasha, he was able to take Palestine in the year 1831. So 3 years into his rule, in the year 1834, 10,000 Muslims from the Muslims of Jerusalem staged an uprising, a revolt against Ibrahim Pasha, and a great battle ensued. 10,000 people, it's a big It's a big revolt, a big uprising. It's not just a few people, 10,000 people. It's a big number, right? So a great battle ensued between these rebels and the army of Ibrahim Pasha. But in the end, Ibrahim Pasha was victorious. He had a stronger army, and he was able to put an end to that uprising in Al-Quds, in Jerusalem. But after that, rebels sprung up in other parts of Palestine as well. Rebels came into other parts, they sprung up in other parts of Palestine as well. So Ibrahim Pasha, he saw this is going to be a big problem, right? That rebels, uprisings are coming everywhere now. First it was only in Jerusalem, now it's in other parts of Palestine as well. So Ibrahim Pasha, he reached out to his father, Al-Khedivate, Muhammad Ali Pasha in Egypt, to send support from Egypt. I need help. Send support from Egypt. So Muhammad Ali Pasha, he sent 5 contingents from the Egyptian army to support his son. And these 5 contingents of the Egyptian army that came were able to defeat the rebels in Palestine and crush the uprising completely. Right? So now Ibrahim Pasha, on behalf of his father, he has control of Palestine and Sham. And he has crushed the uprising that rose against him. So from the year 1831 all the way to the year 1840, for about 9 years, from 1831 to 1840, the Ottomans lost control of Palestine. For those 9 years, the Ottomans did not have control of Palestine, and Palestine during those years, during that time period, came under the lands of Al-Khedivate, Muhammad Ali Pasha. So during this time period, while Palestine was under the rule of Al-Khedivate, Muhammad Ali Pasha, the Ottomans had lost it. During this period from 1831 to 1840, in the year 1838, Muhammad Ali Pasha Al-Khedivate, he allowed the British to open a consulate in Jerusalem. He allowed the British to open a British consulate in Jerusalem. This is the first British consulate opened in Jerusalem. And the first message that the British foreign minister in London, a man named John Henry Temple, the first message that he sent from London to the newly established British consulate in Jerusalem was a message ordering the British consulate to protect the Jews in Jerusalem. Right? This was their main priority, protect the Jews in Jerusalem. So after opening their consulate in Jerusalem, the British became even more bold and more brazen in their plots and in their plans. All right. Finally, in the year 1840, the Ottomans were able to reconquer Sham and Palestine from Al-Khedivate. So the Ottomans got it back. They had lost it for 9 years, from 1831 to 1840. But then in the 1840, the Ottomans were able to reconquer Sham and Palestine from Al-Khedivate. And with this, Palestine and Sham came back under Ottoman rule in the year 1840. Now, meanwhile, in Europe, the Jews in Europe continued to organize themselves. In the year 1860, the Jews founded an organization called the Universal Israeli Alliance. They founded that in Paris, in France, in the year 1860. So basically an organized movement with the goal of the Jews coming together and resettling in Palestine. 2 years later, after the establishment of the Universal Israeli Alliance in France, 2 years later in the year 1862, the German Jewish philosopher, a man named Moses Hess, he published a book. And the name of this book is Rome and Jerusalem. The book Rome and Jerusalem by Moses Hess. This book is basically a blueprint for the Zionist movement. Right? This book, it contains the foundations of Zionism. So in this book, Moses Hess, he called for the Jews to migrate and to settle and establish themselves in Palestine. And he called for the Jews to identify themselves as a nation over identifying themselves as a religion. Right? So Moses Hess, his philosophy was that the Jews should consider themselves a race or a nation or a state instead of just considering themselves a religious group. So he called for the Jews to identify themselves as a nation over identifying themselves as a religion. And he said that no matter what rights the Jews are able to attain in Europe, even if they get full rights as full citizens all over Europe, they will always be looked at as outsiders in Europe, and the Europeans will never consider them to be equal. He said Jews in Europe will always be strangers. So he argued that they should have their own homeland, right? They shouldn't be guests in other people's lands. Rather, they should have their own ethno-state. They should have their own homeland. And he said the only way that the Jews can ever live in dignity is to have their own homeland, their own Jewish nation. They should have a Jewish nation, and that nation should be the land of Palestine. So Moses Hess, he laid all of this out in this book, Jerusalem and Rome, right? And this book was published in the year 1862. So basically that book is the blueprint for the Zionist movement. So you can see here, towards the mid-1860s, 1850s, 1860s, the Jewish push to settle in Palestine and eventually take over Palestine and establish it as their own state, as their own nation, this idea was becoming stronger and stronger. And the momentum towards this idea was gaining a lot of traction and a lot of support, right? But then, in the year 1876, a new ruler came to power as the Sultan of Ad-Dawla al-Uthmaniyya. In the year 1876, a new ruler became the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And this man, alhamdulillah, this man, by the permission of Allah, was able to ruin the momentum of the plans and the plots of the Jews for the next few decades. He was able to throw a wrench in their plans for the next few decades. Right? A very wise ruler, a great ruler. And his name was Sultan Abdul Hamid II, rahimahullah. And inshallah, next week we'll speak more about Sultan Abdul Hamid and his achievements بإذن الله. جزاكم الله خيرا وبارك الله فيكم والله أعلم وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.